Excellent, thank you. Well, good evening. My name is Elizabeth O'Neill, and I'm the Executive Director of the Rothman London campus, as well as the Associate Dean for Booth Global Degree Programs. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to offer just a few words of introduction to Chicago Booth and the London campus. I promise I'll be quite brief before the main session gets underway. So as many of you will know, because there are alumni and students in the room, Chicago Booth is one of the oldest business schools in the world, founded in 1898. In addition, ours was the first executive MBA program in the world, formed in 1943 to strengthen leadership in American business in the wake of World War II. And indeed, this is particularly salient point today as we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe, the Day. Booth is present in Chicago, Hong Kong, and London, and it's the only US institution with permanent campuses in all three continents, or within three continents. And this global presence enables us to better deliver on our twofold mission, to create knowledge and with enduring impact, and to influence and educate current and future leaders. So here in London, the Rothman London campus is home to our flagship Sokolov Executive MBA program, executive education short courses, events hosted by our academic centers or from the college, and a range of public lectures featuring thought leadership like the one this evening. The campus also serves as a regional hub for our alumni community and for hosting conferences and meetings through the London Conference Center. Booth is a school with amazing achievements and assets, and the greatest of those being our world-class faculty. We view scientific research and intellectual debate as the backbone of this institution. And in true Chicago tradition, this means asking and answering important questions about how the world works so that we can understand it better and make better decisions as managers, leaders, and policymakers. So in that spirit tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce one of our faculty, Professor Christian Leuz, who is the current Rothman faculty in residence here in London. And then Professor Leuz will then introduce tonight's session and our special guest speaker. So Professor Leuz is the Charles F. Cole Distinguished Service Professor of Accounting and Finance at Chicago Booth. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research. And importantly, a co-organizer and a member of the university's Clark Center on Global Markets, European Economic Experts Panel. In terms of his research and area of study, Professor Leuz studies the role of disclosure and transparency in capital markets and other settings, including sustainability and ESG, the economic effects of regulations, international accounting, and corporate governance and finance. He has received numerous awards and honors and is recognized as a highly cited researcher by Thomson Reuters. His work has been published in many publications, many academic journals, too many to list this evening, but I do encourage you to check out Professor Leuz's research and his work on our website and also in our publication, Chicago Booth Review. So with that, it's my pleasure to invite Professor Leuz to introduce tonight's session and again, our special guest. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to visit or be here as the faculty in residence. It's been splendid. The campus, if you haven't seen it, you have the ability to later go up. It's really wonderful, wonderful art collection. You walk up the stairs with many Nobel Prize winners at Chicago, so it's quite impressive. So as I said, as Elizabeth said, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, but before I introduce Axel Weber, I'd like to briefly mention an initiative that we've been running at Chicago Booth for some time now that I think is especially relevant in today's political climate. Elizabeth mentioned that I run the European Economic Expert Panel. We actually have 3 of such panels that are organized by the Clark Center for Global Markets at Chicago Booth. And we have one on the US, one that focuses on the EU and the Europe, and one that focuses on finance. Each of the panels is assembles 40 to 50 leading economists from different universities. So they're not all from Chicago, they're from many different institutions. And we survey them regularly on pressing and timely issues, ranging from fiscal policy to digital market regulation. And you see on the right there is a number of recent polls that we ran for the European panel. Now, the primary aim of these polls is to illuminate areas of consensus and disagreement among economists. And the one that I put up here, just to show you one, is the one on tariffs, which obviously connects with tonight's talks. There is usually a number of different questions, so several of them that we asked. This is just the first one on whether you could reduce the trade deficit through tariffs. And the one thing that I've learned, I think that stands out from sort of the experience of running these polls over many years, is that there's actually much more consensus on many of these policy issues, and the answers don't necessarily run along political or party lines, which is why I think these polls are so important. We hope that they contribute meaningfully to public discourse and help policymakers, journalists, and the broader public on these difficult topics. So if you're not yet familiar with these polls, I encourage you to check them out. We put the QR code or the URL and subscribe to the mailing list so you get them automatically when they come out. So with that, it's now my real and personal pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Axel Weber. After starting his academic career at Bonn, Goethe University of Frankfurt, which happens to be my alma mater, and then Cologne, Axel has had a stellar career spanning not only academia, but also central banking and global finance at the highest level. He's currently the president of the Center for Financial Studies at Goethe University, a member of the Group of 30, and the chairman of the Trilateral Commission Europe. Until 2022, and this is probably why many of you will know him, he served as the chairman of UBS Group for a decade, successfully guiding one of the world's largest financial institutions through a period of deep transformation. Before that, he held one of Europe's most influential monetary roles as the president of the German Bundesbank. In this capacity, he served as a member of the ECB's governing council, the board of the BIS, Germany's governor to the IMF, and a member of the G7 and the G20 ministers and governors. Now, most importantly, he had these roles during precarious times, both the 2008 financial crisis and the European sovereign crisis. And in his roles, contributed majorly to global financial stability. In 2011, Axel was considered the leading contender to succeed Jean-Claude Trichet at the ECB, but he stepped down from the Bundesbank due to differences in his prevailing policy visions. That decision, I must say, proved actually very lucky for us at Chicago Booth, because we were able to welcome Axel to Booth as a visiting professor during his cooling off. And during this time, this is when Axel and I became friends. And I can honestly say that I've benefited and learned a tremendous amount from each and every conversation that I've had with Axel. He's not shy, but he has the ability to speak fluently on economic policy, global markets with clarity and insight, which is why I look forward to tonight's talk, which will be about 20 minutes. Then Axel and I will sit down, have a fireside chat, and then bring you in with some Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Axel Weber.
That should work now. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Well, what Christian didn't tell you is I choose Chicago because when you need to cool off, there's no better place than Chicago. I spent the winter there, and I tell you, quite an experience. If you ever get locked down in a snowstorm on Lakeshore Drive, you know what I'm speaking about. It was an absolute pleasure to teach at Chicago at the time because it was an important period. And for me, actually, Chicago still meant that I go back there every year. I used to visit the Midwest, and Chicago was always the stop. Actually, I onboarded UBS through Chicago. All of you might know that the UBS business in Chicago used to be called Payne Weber. It was the core of the US wealth management, and the location was 1 South Wacker, which is where I frequently went. And I was teaching both on campus and at the Leisure Center, for those of you who know Chicago. And I was very surprised in my first lecture. It was full of people coming in from work, and I was very surprised. So I had 50 students in my class, which is kind of the maximum at Chicago that you have for these classes. And I was very surprised that it was fully subscribed. And I asked some of the guys in the first row, why are you listening to my lecture when you could go and listen to all of these professors? They said, we're from UBS. You're a future boss. So it was quite a good onboarding, and I got to know UBS quite well through the Chicago operation. I brought a few slides, which I think sometimes a slide says more than 1,000 words. They were all shocked when I sent them 65 slides, and I said, no, I'll only use about 12 of them. The rest is for the discussion, because I have some things that I might want to allude to in the discussion with Christian later on. So, Christian, thanks for inviting me. This is another beautiful campus of Booth School here in London, and I must say it's really been a pleasure working with the institution. When we talk about U.S. and the title of the talk, I talk about the three aspirations of the three regions. And when we're coming into these trade disputes, the U.S. really comes into it from a prime position. U.S. is standing out in many, many dimensions, including in growth. I look at where sort of average growth rates are around projections that have come in. And what you see is I deliberately choose the period before the trade disruption started impacting on growth projections. But you could really see there's the Anglo-Saxon world that, like Australia and the US, that have 2% growth, largely at the current stage. And you look at Europe or Japan, the other major economic powers, they're around 1%. Actually, when you look at Germany, it's not on this chart, Germany is in the 0% growth. And that was because we had a policy over the years where German industrial capabilities were largely undermined by the kind of policies that were chosen. But if you want more than 2% growth globally, you need to look beyond developed markets. If you look at growth on average for the world, it's at 3%. And it's only at 3% because emerging markets stick out with a 4% growth rate. And then when you want more than 4%, you used to look to China, but China has recently come down in its growth trajectory quite a bit. So 4% is kind of the current consensus where China is. The only major emerging market is that is way above that is India, that has a growth trajectory that is still above 3%. I want you to keep that in mind, because if you pencil in a global growth of 3% and you ask yourself, what will happen as tariffs hit, you're going to see that the first thing that will hit is, and this is a projection that my former colleagues at UBS did, what you see is growth will come down by roughly 0.3 of a percentage point, a bit more than 0.5% over the next 2 years, roughly 0.3 this year and 0.3 next year, in a projection that actually assumed the 10% base tariff. Everything that's been announced beyond 10% is going to add downdraft to this projection. And what you see when you look at who will be actually the countries that suffer most from the imposition of these tariffs, it's the two major parties that are at the core of the tariff dispute, the US and China. So the decline in global growth is largely coming from a decline in US growth perspectives and Chinese growth perspectives in both of these years. And because of these tariffs, even if they're mentioned to be reciprocal tariffs, they affect China more than they affect the US. But there is a price the US pays for these tariffs in the sense of its own growth being slower under these tariffs than they would otherwise have been. Counterfactual with no tariffs would have been better for the US. And that's why I think your survey answered that most of them think that the tariffs don't solve the problem the US has, and therefore it's not going to be beneficial. There is some understanding on my side that why the US would look at tariffs towards China, because if you look at the global trajectory for how Chinese and non-Chinese export volumes have developed in sort of the post-financial crisis, you can actually see that there was a steady upswing in exports. The world grew together a lot more, but this is nothing compared to when you add the 2000s or the 1990s. There was much more growth of exports and global integration in those periods. Ever since the 90s and the integration of China into the global division of labor, there was a massive increase in global trade, but also it came with an increase in global production. But then you see, whilst the rest of the world came out pretty sluggishly from from the COVID and the pandemic, China really took off in terms of its export. And that was largely because China could reassemble its internal supply chain much quicker than global supply chains got reassembled. And therefore, China really gained massively. And of course, if you look at that from the perspective of a US policymaker, you have the feeling, well, there's a sense of, not so just division of labor now, because China's taken off. We're coming out flatlining from the pandemic, but China's really gaining massively globally competitive. So I do understand where they come from, but then the question is, where is it all going? If you add another slide, you can actually see that what we see now in terms of tariffs and in terms of restrictions for global trade, this is nothing new. It's relatively new in the sense that we hadn't seen that before the financial crisis. But ever since, in particular in recent years, and the first Trump administration is part of these recent years, global restrictions on goods, on services, and on cross-border investments have really taken off. We're not in a world anymore of liberalizing trade flows and capital flows and service flows. We're in a world of more restrictions. And the restrictions, in particular in the blue area, are dominantly driven by restrictions on trade, whether it's quotas, whether it's tariffs, whether it's other forms of non-tariff barriers. They're massively increasing over time, in particular at the current juncture. And of course, if you want to add 24 and 25, these numbers will just tick up. The bar would actually be much higher if you add 24 and 25 with everything that's been added. If you look at China, and again, this is sort of looking at the period before the current Trump tariffs, you can see that tariffs are nothing new. Trump 1 led to some tariffs being introduced, and a feature of that was they started with very low rates, below 5%. They crept up to something that was close to between 15 and 20%, and stayed there during the entire Biden administration. What the Biden administration did not do is undo any of the tariffs imposed in terms of the rates of tariff, but also when you look at the amount of goods and covered by tariff. This was initially just a small fraction of tariff, but by and large, it covered 60% of goods traded from China into the US during the Biden administration. Of course, you know that what Trump announced in the start of this year was 100% of the goods covered at a rate that was first 25%, and then when the whole thing escalated, it was above 100%. So it's 100% of the trade covered and more than 100% rate, which is prohibitive. If you have 100% trade taxes, it is an embargo, because at that price addition, goods don't move forward. So we're de facto in a period of an embargo. And then the question is, how will this get resolved? You just saw today the announcement of this, I'm quoting the announcement out of the White House, fantastic new deal with the UK. And that will set the stage for further trade deals to be announced. China is in the start of these negotiations, and we'll see what comes out. I can't tell you. The current feature around this administration and its international trade policy is uncertainty and volatility are the two buzzwords you see most when related to US policy at the moment. I think I would add a third one, and a declining trade and a declining trend of international trade. So volatility around what I think will be a declining trend for some time to come. If you look at actually at tariffs, and this is why the word reciprocal tariff features, and it's not that the US is unilaterally imposing tariffs. You actually, if you look at tariffs on a number of goods, you can actually see, if you look at EU import tariffs on US goods and US import tariffs on European goods, you may get a sense that the reciprocity of these tariffs comes from the fact that sort of the upper bar is more populated, with the Europe having more tariffs and higher tariffs on US imports into Europe than the other way around. And that's where some of the lingo by the current administration that Europe needs to reduce is justified by the actual picture if you take an unbiased snapshot of where these tariffs are. So, I fully understand where everyone's coming from, but even if you understand two parties arguing, it doesn't mean that the result of that argument is on an improvement of the global economy or of the welfare of each of the parties that are in this trade dispute. The next thing I'd like you to look at is when you try and understand where this goes to, you have to look at where are the bilateral trade deficits from the partners coming from. And I'll show you another graph on that later on. And what you see is quite clearly when looking at a US perspective, the biggest part is China. Then there's Mexico. Then there's the EU, but the EU is largely driven by that one bar that is called Germany. Then there's Vietnam. And there's a couple of other countries, including Canada. I'm very surprised that on this metric, Canada is so far down. And then when you look at the areas where Europe has a trade dispute with the US, it's actually three major areas. One is pharmaceuticals. The second one is vehicles. And the third one is machinery. Everything else is second order. And that's why when you read what the European Commission is putting together as an answer to the US trade dispute, it's all around pharmaceuticals, it's all around vehicles, and it's all around machinery. And actually, the US tariffs are solely focused on that, the prime one being vehicles. Now, again, in another way, look at the left-hand side. What is Europe in terms of Trump's language? You hold no cards. Which cards does Europe hold in this trade dispute? I mean, these are the cards the Americans hold. It's vehicles, pharmaceuticals, machinery, and other. And Europe holds one card, which is fuels. And that's a card they can't play because they actually started relying on US supplies of fuels in order to move away from the dependence on Russia. And they will not reverse that. So the biggest red point is out. You just can't do that. And then when you look beyond that, it's aircraft, it's grains and agriculture product, but the bars don't move the needle. And I want you to remember that because I'm going to show you some simulations about what happens in retaliations of trade if the one side retaliates against tariffs by the other. Actually, this is an interesting chart because it tells you if you look at imports and exports and you look at the differential tariffs, that the countries more exposed than Europe are actually India, Thailand, Mexico, and China. And some emerging markets feature heavily there. It's just not that the number of, in terms of exports and import volume are important, but the tariffs that are associated with are very important. And if tariffs are name of the game rather than export restriction, then these tariffs are going to hit some of these emerging markets quite hard, in particular the ones that have pretty unbalanced trade with the United States. This is my favorite chart. I often read that the American president is the accidental game. I would agree to that when it comes to one-shot games. I would disagree with it when it comes to repeated games. Repeated games you need to solve from the end. You solve a game from the end, or you know that if you start a trade dispute, which is a simple game matrix I'm trying to show you here, the best situation is free trade. The worst is a complete embargo with tariffs for everyone. And then you can gain if you impose a trade and the other side doesn't, you can better yourself relative to the other one. But it's a not stable equilibrium because nobody will accept that as an equilibrium. So moving from A to B leads you to C. Third best outcome. And I think the question about global trade is all about how can we retain a second best outcome when the threat is that tariffs and retaliatory tariffs and retaliation of retaliation leads us to a third best outcome that is really not good for everyone. This was what was in the first figure. Actually, you look at the countries that are here, you can clearly see that China for the US is a core issue, and you can see that the areas where you talk about electronics, it's machinery, and all of these things. The second one and the third one are Mexico, Vietnam, and then Canada. Canada and Mexico larger than the other two. What is happening here? What is happening here is that Mexico and Canada allowed China over the last years to reroute traffic of trade from China through Mexico and Canada into the US market with a NAFTA deal. And so they became a turnstile for Chinese exports into the US market via these locations. And what the US administration does, quite rationally, is say, unless you apply to China at the external borders of the US and of NAFTA, the same tariffs we do on China, we will treat everything coming from Mexico and Canada as potentially being Chinese, and we will put a tariff on it. So that is the core of the discussion on tariffs between the US, Canada, and Mexico when it comes to NAFTA and how NAFTA will function in the future. Vietnam. Why is Vietnam there? Well, Vietnam's there because Vietnam's been used throughout the entire post-war period by China as a turnstile into the US, because after the Vietnam War, the US gave Vietnam a preferred trade agreement in order to help rebuild Vietnam, and most of the production in Vietnam is geared towards the US without that. And of course, if you look at the collaboration in Vietnam with Chinese companies, Chinese build a big presence in co-investment structures with Vietnamese companies to export into them. So again, fully understand. The only outlier that it isn't like that is Germany, and I must say, but Germany has a pretty lopsided trade with China. With the US. If you look at the German trade, and that's what dominating European, it's pharmaceuticals. The pharma industry is big in Germany, and it's cars. I'm willing to bet you that even if there is a tariff on US cars and European cars in the US, that German car manufacturers would still sell cars in the US. Why do I believe that? Well, you all know this Janis Joplin song. My friends all drive Mercedes-Benz. My friends all drive Porsches, and I drive Mercedes-Benz. It's a luxury product. It's a product that will still be sold to segments of the US market if there is a tariff. Actually, what is quite interesting is German car manufacturers sell German cars cheaper in the US than they sell them at home, because they mark to market. They look at the most competitive, likely product in the US, and they gear the price towards that. That will end with tariff. But I don't think it will kill the demand to zero. It will reduce it. But I think it will have the effect that German cars will be considered even more of a luxury brand, even so buyers will reduce. Well, what happens if you impose tariffs and Europe retaliates? Take the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the picture. The left-hand side is a US tariff. And then the right-hand side is, it's a trade effect and it's a value-added effect when you look at production. And the right-hand side is if Europe retaliates. The big picture I want you to remember, nothing happens. Those bars are roughly the same. Europe, in terms of tariffs, holds very few cards where they can actually retaliate in tariffs against the US. And that's a sobering exercise. Even though the Commission is designing this big package on how they respond with tariffs on goods, they're looking down the wrong hole. This is what matters. If you look at the United States, geographical composition of exports and imports in three major areas: goods, services, and capital flows. The US, in my view, is embarking on a dispute with Europe where they look at where they are on the receiving side of a surplus from Europe in terms of imports into the US on goods, but they completely forget that they have a massive surplus in terms of exports from the US into Europe on services, be it financial services or digital services. The Magnificent Seven are global companies, and a big part of their consumer base is in Europe, and financial flows. Most European portfolios have a massive overweight on US assets. Now, if you enter into a trade war, don't believe that the rules of the game will be fair. The other side will play those cards and embark on those levers that hit you and hurt you most. They will not stick to the WTO principle of embargo on trade means retaliation with trade. If Europe is hit by the US, these two bars that are to the downside, services and capital flows, will be part of the game. And this is what will happen. If Europe sees harbors in San Francisco stockpile with European cars, they're going to focus on the lady. The lady that is here is not one of the CEOs of the companies, but I didn't find a better picture where you just see them without anybody else. But those are the four CEOs that are going to feel it most. Why? Because Europe is going to look at digital and other services as a potential for taxes. They will call it value-added tax, which Europe has. They will increase value-added tax. And what they could do, quite simply, is they could make a discriminatory tax for digital services provided from within the European Union and from outside. Because that's the same logic on digital that the US has on goods. You get off quite nicely. So what will happen? These people will be forced to build European factories where they're supplying European clients with products like Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Amazon, out of European subsidiaries fully taxed in Europe, where tariffs will be imposed in the sense that if you try and provide those services from outside Europe, you face an additional charge relative to services from within. And the same is true for capital flows. If you go down this road, the whole arsenal of torture instruments from the 19th century is on the table. We used to have something like stamp tax. The stamp tax, Switzerland had it, still has it. When I was running UBS, it was one of the biggest problems we had in Switzerland was if you invest into the Swiss stock market, you pay a stamp duty. Actually, the French love that too because they introduced it after the financial crisis. There is a financial transaction tax in France that you don't pay in Germany. So if I buy French equity, I pay this financial transaction. The stamp duty in Switzerland is such that you pay a stamp duty nevertheless. But if I buy Swiss Re, that stamp duty is a fraction of what it is when I buy Munich Re. Because it is discriminatory to investments outside Switzerland if you do them in the Swiss market through the Swiss stock exchange. So that's an area where I think you need to tread very, very carefully, because if you don't want to embark on a fully fledged war on the economy, including tariffs, financial services, digital services, and capital flows, you better stop the first one. And I think that's where ultimately some of the discussion in the future will end up, because we're seeing the downdraft that is happening as retaliation leads to a retaliation of retaliation. This could escalate. So I'm firmly convinced that in the end, economic rationale prevails, and therefore we will see this settled after a quite, I would say, tremendous overture. When the main opera plays, in the end, it will end up, in my view, in a better place. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Axel. This was really fantastic, and also, as I said, very clear with lots of insights. So what I would like to do is talk a little bit about the three kind of pillars that we had for the talk. Talk a little bit about Asia, talk about the US and Europe, and maybe start with China. And you showed us this one graph that was sort of showing how Chinese exports have sort of boomed in recent years, relatively speaking, and that had to do with global sort of supply chains. But if we sort of zoom out a little bit and go back in time more generally, I mean, China has done incredibly well with its exports. And I think it is important on how you look at this and what your analysis is of what causes that. And so is the idea here that China is engaging in some manipulative practices and subsidies that help substantially their exports, or is it that China has become much more competitive? And I think how you come out on that question probably should inform policy, and you would probably have different policy responses depending on what you think it is. And I'd be curious in A, what your analysis is, and then what would be your response if you were sort of in charge in terms of what Europe should do or the US do in terms of their dealings with China?
So it's a bit of both. So as far as China is concerned, you can never say it's the one or the other. It's a bit of both always. I think China has pretty strong internal controls when it comes to competition of companies in China competing with Chinese companies. In particular, when it comes to the large state-owned enterprises, there is a privatization or a opening up of those state-owned enterprises, but actually they are quite protected. If I look at banks like UBS, we've been in China for more than years, but it was never quite a level playing field because everything that you do in China is organized around quotas. So if you want to do more business, you need to have a better quota allocated. And then within these quotas, it is also the volumes of business and the number of clients that you can have. And for both of that, that is pretty centrally registered. So I remember every trip, every half year when I went to China, I went to see the central bank and say, we are at the limit of the new quota. There's QFII quotas for foreign investment into China. There's QDI quotas for Chinese investment outside. A bank like UBS every half year was at the quota, and then you go and talk to the authorities, can we increase the quota? So there is that element in competition in China. There's also, when you look at rules of engagement, these state-owned enterprises are large enterprises. And when you look at, full value accounting and whether salaries are subsidized, things are not very clear. China has very low salaries. They've increased massively over time, but there is some elements of lack of competition within the China market. And that has an impact on their ability to export, because to the degree that actually labor costs continue to be artificially low in China, that gives them a better integration into the global market. When it comes to new technologies, and there's actually quite an interesting chart in the Draghi report, whether it's quantum computing, whether it's internet services, whether it's technology in general, China by now even has an edge on the US. So whilst if you go to China and talk, I'm largely working with fintechs now, and you go and talk to fintechs in China, they say Silicon Valley, that's like last innovation. We're current. And so there's an enormous self-confidence when it comes to internet, digital quantum computing, and all of that, where China actually is leading technology. If you look at Chinese cars, there's 3 generations of cars on the road. There's like the German cars that are built around combustion. There's Tesla, who put a battery at the core of the car and put stuff around it, but they use a third of the parts. We showed that once at the UBS study. And there's Chinese cars that are built around the smartphone. They're so interoperable with your personal services and everything that they are now new records of sales every month in Germany. So there will be competition. And this is not where I think that they're competing over an unfair price. I think on cars, they're genuinely competing on a different product of a different generation. I would say the latest innovation part. And so it depends. It depends where you look.
So how would you respond to then if that sort of is the answer by Europe and the US in the end? They just need to get their act together, meaning they need to do more R&D, need to make sure there's innovation, and that's the way to compete? Or can you, to some extent, also see, given the first part of your answer, that there need to be some protective measures given the skew?
No, so I'm a global. All my jobs were global. I believe in a global division of labor, and I think moving from the current status quo to anything that's more controlled and deglobalized has the cost. So I'm not in favor of going down that road at all. But what you see now is, as I said, I think the option of a first best solution is pretty much gone. And then all you need to focus on is, if you don't want to get to third best, what could be a second best deal? And I think in a second best deal, these tariffs may help if soon settled. I don't think tariffs at 10% really move the needle in terms of a company. If we had a 10% increase in cost or a 10% reduction in our revenues, we would make that up in a year or two. So that is something that you can overcome. If you go much higher, it becomes a real disturbance of global flow. And I think we would not be well advised if we do that at this point in time. So it's very hard to say how, once you start these tariff disputes, how do you get off that? And I think the best is if you announce a deal where both sides claim this is great for both sides. Everyone knows it, but it's better than what would happen if you go further down the road. So I'm a firm believer that we need to continue a global division of labor. I think my view to the US is we need to continue to work with the US wherever they're willing to collaborate with Europe and with Asia Pacific. And where they're no longer willing to collaborate, we need to grow our own ability to do things without the United States. And in Europe, that will mean defense, because the US is clearly focusing on Asia Pacific and South China Sea as the next conflict area. And they're gearing all of their military concentration on that area. I grew up outside Ramstein Air Base in Germany. The Americans were there for the entire post-war period, but believe me, at Ramstein Air Base, the Americans have been retreating for 50 years, year after year after year, reducing their presence in Europe and moving their presence to the Middle East and now further out to China. This is not new. This is nothing that this administration has started. It's a continuation of a journey. And in the region, we always adapted to this journey. I live at Frankfurt, my second home, and I'm at Frankfurt University. Frankfurt University is the best campus you see in Germany. Why? It used to be the NATO headquarters of the American troops. And when they left Frankfurt as the headquarters, they gave the headquarters to the university as a campus. Every downside has an opportunity. And that is now something that has benefited Frankfurt tremendously. So I'm not in the camp that is sort of critical to what the US does in its foreign policy, where they think the biggest challenge is. And I think the biggest challenge they identified is China, its emergence, and that's what they focus on. That means it leaves rooms for us to fill the gap. Because if we don't fill the gap, then we have a vacuum. We have a vacuum of power at the European level, and we can't afford it. It's actually a big chance also for the UK to come back into a sort of more aligned European strategy when it comes to sort of geopolitics, which I think is a good start also for the UK after Brexit, to work with Europe on a more neutral basis without having a reopening of the discussion about whether Brexit was a good thing. Brexit is done. What we now need to do is work with the UK to have a better relationship from where this ended after Brexit. And I think that's, again, it's a second best solution in my view, as a convinced European. And for the UK, it's a huge opportunity to come back within that European brotherhood.
Let's talk a little bit more about Europe. This is actually where I was going to go next. So I want to get your take. You had the European Rebound, and at the end of the title, you had Too Good to Be True. So I want to talk a little bit about. So first, you started out with a sort of rather bleak picture of European growth being anemic compared to the US and some of the other regions of the world. And in particular, Germany, you mentioned, is in that 0% club. But there's sort of two things. And for the first part of the question, you have to indulge me as a microeconomist. You're a macroeconomist, so you can clarify this for me. But it seems to me sometimes when we do these growth comparisons, they're somewhat unfair when you have vast differences in the budget deficits that you see across the world. So the US gets 2% growth in your chart, but has currently running a 6% deficit. And even if you focus on the primary deficit, not including the debt service, it's over 3%. To me, that seems like an unfair comparison, because if you put that much into the German economy, you probably would have higher growth too. And then speaking of that juicing of the economy, I'd be curious what your sense is that refocusing of Europe on defense, what will that do, given that defense historically has led to innovations in other areas, civilian areas and so on, think GPS, internet and so on. What will that potentially do to European growth?
So first, I fully agree on view of debt and growth. Actually, for me, the deal of having zero deficits and 0% growth looks better than 7% deficits and 2%. I think the US is auctioning its future by adding to its debt at a rate that is completely unsustainable in peacetime. 7% is a wartime-like deficit. And if in peacetime you have wartime-like deficit, it comes to haunt you at some point. They're sailing massively with a straight line. I'm quoting the budget of the budget office in the US. They're sailing to 120% by the end. 100% is usually what Carmen Reinhardt talk about when it comes to sustainability versus non-sustainability of debt dynamics. So the US is on a fiscal trajectory that they need to correct. And when you look at the US, who's going to correct that fiscal trajectory? Nobody. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are going to correct that. And so that is in my view, difficult task. You add on to that you then start embarking on discussions about zero coupon conversion of US treasuries, or a new Plaza Accord, which standstill agreement by the rest of the world to use the dollar as the major currency and to not look into diversifying like China and many of the emerging markets are doing with other currencies. And actually Bitcoin and digital currencies will drive a lot more diversification in these systems with other currencies that are not the dollar. So that all adds, in my view, quite a dangerous mix. And you saw that when the market moved on the announcement in the US, when suddenly you had 50 more basis points in US Treasuries in the 10 years. I give this talk for a long time, and I've been saying for the entire year, the only thing that will discipline this administration is the bond market. The bond market will give a very clear signal on sustainability versus not. If you're in this country and you go back to Liz Truss, you don't have to tell anybody that the bond market is strong enough to discipline a government if the trajectory of fiscal policy is not.
I was actually going to ask you that. Do you think the US will see a Liz Truss moment?
Well, it takes a lot for the US. Being the numeraire of the system, I think there are increasingly around the edges people getting concerned about that status over a 20-year trajectory. I don't think people are nervous on a 1-year. I think there is no alternative to the dollar as the international numeraire of the system. Remember, before we got there, we had gold as an international numeraire. Pegging to gold is no longer an option. But safe havens like gold or Swiss franc, where I used to live, are picking up a lot of global volatility in the sense that these safe havens outside the US actually trade higher. If you'd ask me, Germany announces a 1 trillion program for investment into military, and at the same time, Bund spreads versus the dollar fall, I would have told you, I don't think that that's a possible scenario that we would ever see, but it happened. And so I think what we're seeing is not a loss of trust in the dollar, but a repricing of the dollar, where that higher uncertainty and volatility gets priced even into the core of the European, of the global financial system. And there is a risk premium, even if small. 50 basis points is not a big risk premium. There is now a small risk premium. And that small risk premium is likely to go away if these discussions about trade die out. It's likely to stay if we continue to have disruptions on the trade side.
So then that gets me to my last question, and then I will open it up for questions from the audience. What concerns me a lot is that if you think about sort of what Trump's central thesis is that he at least sort of start out with, is he has this, when he talks to the base, he talks about how he wants to bring manufacturing back. But what the policy created is massive uncertainty and volatility. You said that that's the number one thing that people associate with the current policy. Now, if you want to bring manufacturing back, if you want to sort of make sure that the US can actually service its debt, continue to grow, what you need is investment. And what seems to be that this uncertainty and volatility is highly sort of damaging to that type of investment. And on top of that, they seem to be, as you said, they started from a position of the top. They seem to be endangering a sector that's actually doing incredibly well. That's their tech sector. And the tech sector actually doesn't need any of these tariffs. The optimal tariffs for the sector are probably zero. So what I worry is that, sort of this policy is going to lead to a dead end. But then the question is, how's the US going to come off that horse? It's like, what do you see as sort of how this is going to play out? You seem to be optimistic earlier, but I'm sort of curious, how do you think this is going to play out? If there isn't the bond markets having the Liz Truss moment, sort of how we're going to get to something that's more reasonable.
So governments very often, when they communicate, focus on what is it that I need to say to get my base rallied behind. Every political leader will tell you, if you give a sense of direction and you march off as a political leader, and you then look behind and there's nobody behind you, you're not a leader. And that's where I think Trump gears the whole tariff debate at its base. And the base wants to see America reindustrialized and these manufacturing jobs coming back to the Midwest. But if you look at the tariffs, they're not on manufacturing jobs. And even if they're done, will they bring manufacturing jobs back? No. The area where he's concerned, say European cars and pharmaceuticals, are definitely not going to be jobs that the US doesn't on pharmaceutical have anyway, but they're in different areas. This is not manufacturing. And the second one, if you look at US car manufacturers, top 5 vehicles in every state sold is SUVs built in America. European cars don't even compete on a scale in any of the US states among the top 5 cars. So it's not as if the US is short of manufacturing capabilities and capacity to produce US cars,
And
which is
it's even sometimes German cars, the biggest exporter.
biggest exporter
of
is
SUVs.
BMW. BMW exports a lot of cars globally. If I buy in Germany a BMW or a Mercedes and it's an SUV, it's more likely than not to build in the US and re-import it to Europe because the bigger market is the US market for SUVs. So I don't think that that is really the core of what he wants to achieve, but it's a convenient communication that basically targets these tariffs in some fragments of tariffs to the base that has been supporting Trump. But the tariffs are much broader based. They're across the spectrum. And actually, if you try and look as a trade theorist at the tariff formula, you shake your head. But it's not a tariff formula. Don't try and understand this formula as a tariff. It's an autarky. It's a very simple formula that says, how much do I import relative to everything I import? And that formula leads to 0 tariffs if there's no. Which means what the administration is trying to engineer is a reversal of the outsourcing of supply chains into countries like China in particular, that with the lockdown and the pandemic has shown a vulnerability to US manufacturing that simply wasn't there. My view is we have over-optimized the world in supply chains by basically producing just-in-time manufacturing globally in a completely outsourced global supply chain. You add to that shocks like the pandemic. What you see is these supply chains are effective, but they're not robust. And so if the whole idea is let's move to a more robust global division of labor, a more robust division of labor means a robust supply chain. That means I need to resource some of that supply chain into the market. And actually, a good friend of mine, Janet Yellen, she was Treasury Secretary, she talked about nearshoring and friendshoring. This administration talks about onshoring. It's not enough, it's not good enough to have it in Canada and Mexico because they're in a trade dispute with Canada and Mexico. So it's onshoring. And what the US wants to do is, in case of a conflict, it wants to have onshore capabilities that prevent another breakdown of supply chains. Now, the Biden administration didn't act as strongly. They actually kept everything Trump put in place, but they didn't add to it. Trump, too, very strongly adds to it. And putting tariffs up is an incentive for US companies to reshore. That's the aim. It's not about building manufacturing jobs in the US. It's about building a robust manufacturing environment with supply chains insourced rather than globally sourced. And I think that's more what they're driving at. It doesn't mean you will ever have manufacturing jobs in Illinois different to the ones you already have. But it means that the products they're using, the parts they're integrating into that production, they will no longer be produced in China or overseas. A large part of that will be basically produced close to home or at home in the future.
So you should become the explainer of their policies, because when you talk about them, they sound a lot more sensible than when I read about them. But let's take some questions.
But that's a good point. The good point is, look, I firmly believe that if the only thing that you can bring up as an argument, if you're trying to understand policies by governments and what I think are rational actors, is that they just make no sense, then you haven't understood what they're doing. I think governments know quite well what they're doing, but they sometimes don't tell you. And I think in particular, this administration adds a lot of noise. I mean, you know, the signal to noise ratio at the current juncture is pretty high. I started reading my daily newspapers on Saturday because by that time, only 50% of the stuff that is in the papers is gone and done. So I enjoy reading on Saturday the news, and by reading it not every day, I filter out. And you should start doing that too.
Okay, so let's take some questions. So we had a mic issue earlier. Please wait until we have lapel mics that are going around, right? So
Okay.
there's one question up here in the front. And just maybe quickly say who you are and keep the question short, given that we're going to run over a little bit, given that we started late, but we don't have that much time. So keep your question short.
Sure. My name is Melvin. I'm a fund manager in the UK. I have been following your footsteps of not reading the newspaper every day because it's all negative news. But I've got a few points, and I'm only going to stick to one because I want to give everyone a chance. The reality, I mean, you hit the nail on the head that China has kept its salaries artificially low. But even the Western economies, I mean, today in many cities, including London, even a salary of 100,000, which very few people actually earn, it's not exactly a luxurious salary. But the point I'm trying to get to you, sir, is that whether it is the main jobs, the factory jobs, or supply chain jobs, it's not the question of, it's not like a Lego block where you pick it from China and put it in. The reality of is that UK, US, lots of Europe do not have the skills. Forget the mentality, hard work, attitude, etc., etc. So that's kind of one point I wanted to kind of share with you, and what is your thoughts on that? And the second point is that what should Germany do? What should UK, Europe do? Not exactly to kind of kill China, but kind of really to revive its domestic economy, because at 0.1%, a lot of the population is really economically suffering.
Yeah, so maybe two. The first one is, I think if you look at China and, for example, smartphone production, take Apple, there are whole factories, there are whole cities where employers work in a single factory all day long putting these telephones together. You will never have US workers or European workers work under that condition for that hours at that time. So you can resource that. It'll take you a couple of years to build these factories. It'll take you even longer to find the workforce to operate them. And then you end up talking about some of these phones having 2 times, 3 times the price that they now have. So what Europe, in my view, has done wrong is we have been a firm believer, Germany first and foremost, of this international global division of labor being there forever. We've outsourced energy to Russia, manufacturing to China, technology to the US, financial services largely to the US. You look at the comparison of some of the German banks compared to the US banks, they're a fraction of the market cap. And so we were completely embedded in this global economy. And then you get this diversification shock, and you suddenly realize maybe 100% reliance on services and manufacturing outside is over-optimized, so you need to go back. It will come at a cost, and it will take time. But I think in the future, you'll see more capabilities sort of in Europe developed. But look, Europe never had a problem with understanding the issues. Europe has an implementation. I mean, if Europe has a problem, they ask an Italian prime minister to write a report about it, Mario Draghi, Mr. Letta, Mr. Monti, and then we take note of it and go to sleep. Nothing happened. Europe has an implementation problem, not a recognition problem. We understand the problems, but acting on them in a pretty crowded bus of 27 countries, where everyone wants to be the driver and nobody wants to sit on the back seat, is a difficult endeavor. And that's where I think we need to grow to a more robust governance. I think the one thing that is happening now is, Europe has been held back by this unanimity decision for many, many times. At the moment, prime minister like Mr. Orban can block certain decisions. He will just be told, I'm pretty sure in the future of Europe, you're on the back seat, you're not in the driver's seat. We're going to take majority decisions, we're going to move. But that's a small step. We need to also be able to act. And if you then look at the Draghi report and you look at the market cap of Google, Amazon, Facebook, and you look at their research budget, what these companies do is they're the global leaders on technology. They have budgets to invest and ring fence a wall around them that will stop any competitor to be even able to penetrate the core of their business. And Europe, if you look at Deutsche Telekom, which is the one I would turn to when it comes to cloud solutions in Germany, Their budget and market cap is a rounding error. A rounding error. And to make that a real investment, you need a massive European capital. I started two funds that I always advertise. I'm going to take the liberty to do it here. I call it mega funds. Make Europe great again. You know, and the mega funds are simply around industry and financial services. But actually, the difficulty is if you put in some of these companies that are supposed to drive the European reaction, for example, by investing into military capabilities, like Leonardo, Thales, Rheinmetall. Actually, when you put Rheinmetall into a portfolio at the start of the year, it was 600. Then now it's 1,600. So it's not that it's not profitable. But the problem is, if you run a UTIX compliant fund in Luxembourg, and anything has a label weapons on it, you can't put it in. If you think that the future of Europe is reindustrialization and building capabilities around steel and manufacturing of tanks and ammunitions, you should look at what this means against the green directive of Europe and anything that is environmentally problematic. So yes, Europe is embarking on a new journey, but they still have the rules and regulations in place, and they won't change them anytime soon, that actually stop exactly these companies and capabilities to be able to draw in European funding and retail investors to invest in these capabilities. So as Europe is at this juncture, I think they need to act much faster, much more fundamentally, and enable the two projects that they never got to fruition. A capital market union and a banking union is a necessary, not sufficient, a necessary condition for Europe to be able to invest into its future and compete with the US on their capital market. The supremacy of the US is driven out of its capital market and its performance. And that is something that Europe will never be able to replicate in the next 10 years, because capital markets union, you talk to a French citizen, they don't like capital, they don't like markets, they like unions, okay? So there you are. You basically start encountering a lot of problems if you talk about capital market union, because it's not seen as something desirable from a European culture. We don't have a capital market culture. And developing it will be very, very hard to do. So
let's try to get two more questions really real quick. And then, let me, here in the front, and then let's actually do, if you can ask your question, and then I'll take one from the back.
And I'll say one sentence.
And then we'll do, short answers, short questions. Okay, please go ahead.
All right, thank you. This is Carrie Zhang. I work at Bernstein APAC Equity Sales in London. So arguably the title US Exceptionalism is embodied by the US dollar supremacy, which essentially is kind of the mirror image of the whole offshoring to China and other manufacturing countries. So, so in light of the recent changes, like me, I am personally highly convicted that Chinese domestic consumption will be subsidized by the government to finally pick up as a percentage of GDP and absorb all the excess capacity that's left behind by the US de facto embargo. But as part of that, do you think the US consumers are ready to accept a lowering of their consumption power that more properly mirrors their manufacturing productivity? Or else I want to see Europe playing a more proactive role in the multipolar world order. I was hoping to see what you think Europe could do as US supremacy declines and we finally hopefully enters into a multipolar world order over the next 30 to 50 years.
Great, that was a lot of questions, but we'll take one from the, so then Axel, you hold these in your thoughts in the back, yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you. So my question was going to be, you spoke very eloquently about the various changes and volatility that's happening in the world right now, both from a people and from a financial economic perspective. What do you think are the top three things that are going to stay the same? So not things that are going to be different, it's going to stay the same.
What's going to stay the same?
It's going to stay the same.
Things are going to stay the same.
Oh.
That you talked about many changes.
Well, I do think we are at a period where lots of things are changing. I, for example, still think that it will be very hard to get on top of the US excellence and outperformance in capital markets. I have a couple of slides. I just want to fast forward to, so the one thing you have to understand is, this is the, no, this is way too far. It just seems to go in one direction. Oh, I need to just.
At the bottom, yeah.
If you look at the slide which I wanted to show you, this is a very telling slide, and this is a very telling slide. If you look at the US equity market performance, you can actually see that the US MSCI and the rest of the world ex-US, look at that difference. And that difference comes from really extraordinary earnings of US corporates that are very, very profitable. This is not an expansion of multiples. This is when you go fast forward, and I'll go there now, because that tells you where it comes from. This is something that we have to acknowledge, that when it comes to the US, the chart that shows you there is the expansion of the US stock market, and the other one is the expansion of earning powers of US corporates. In particular, the magnificent step. It's all earning power of US corporates. That's the real economy. I really don't think that it is easy to beat the outperformance of the US. That's why I was talking about exceptionalism in the US, in particular in the stock market. The US is going to perform well. US corporates are so robust and so profitable. If you hit any corporate with a 10%, 15%, 20% shock, European corporates are going to suffer to recover from that. US corporates are going to shake it off. And that's where I don't believe, like the lady was asking in the first row, that this will substantially undermine the US resilience. For the US, this is a setback. I don't think this will lead to a decline in the US and suddenly a miracle emergence of China and Europe to take the lead table. This will show that if the US retreats, we will actually start investing a lot of money in order to fill the gap rather than to build. And military is one example for me, because if you look at what Germany is doing now, it's a, you know, in economics, we talk about butter and cannon. This was supposed to be a cannonball, but to get it done, they needed the Greens to agree, the Social Democrats to agree, so half of it is butter. The other half is still cannons, but the problem is cannons are not productive. Cannons have very little investment multipliers that go beyond fostering the economy to grow outside the companies that basically produce it. It creates some jobs, but it doesn't have the same multiplier as building an infrastructure on which you can put. So
would this be, just to interject, would this be true with some of the new technologies that we're seeing in, for instance, the Russia-Ukraine war, that is very different from like old style cannons being the main thing?
Yeah, no, it will lead. I mean, it's a bit like, you know, people hate Formula One, but most of the progress in car safety is done in Formula. People will hate this program, but most of the progress on technology will be done by actually putting some of these drones and some of the experimental there. It will actually lead to a leapfrogging of technology in Europe if we focus on that. You know, I'm a firm believer that whenever you start building something, if you build it now, as opposed to in the past, this will lead to massive effect. Take Germany and the reparations, we're just on the 80th. After the Second World War, Germany and Japan invested massively into rebuilding from a wartime economy, and they put the latest technology in place, and that gave them an edge in car manufacturing and in many other areas. If Europe now starts investing heavily into capabilities around latest military technology, this will have positive spillovers, not just in the military complex, but also in the civil complex of our economies and of production. So I do think there will be a value-added multiplier that will kick in later, but they usually have a lag time of 5 to 10 years. It doesn't immediately lead to an improvement. So long-term, I think it is the right thing to do. And I think, you know, Europe is just catching up with the US. You look at what happened after 9/11. Why were soldiers in Ramstein moved back to base, and what did the US do? The US started developing a military complex that was technology driven and no longer embodied people on the ground. It was done through military technology and the ability to strike everywhere at the same time out of space. And if you look at US soldiers before 9/11 and 20 years after, their technology, human technology, hybrid form of armament is something completely different than what you saw before 9/11. So all of these things will lead to developments down the road that are in principle positive, but it will not mean that Europe is catching up. It will mean that the US, in my view, will continue to be at the forefront of developments and that we will be less dependent on the US in the future, which is good, but it doesn't mean that we will surpass the US. The US is going to still be, whether it's capital markets, whether it's technology, whether it's financial services, it'll set the global standard. And we shouldn't be under any illusion. There's a lot of nationalism around Europe now saying we have to go out, now the Americans are retreating from Europe. That's not true. The Americans are focusing on a different region in the world that concerns them. And we in Europe got to keep that collaboration with them going where we can and develop our own strengths where we can't keep that. That's my message that I always have. Don't make this an anti-American issue. Make it a challenge for Europe, and Europe has to step out of this sort of relying on others and face its own responsibility. I'll end on one sentence. You all might remember a picture where Chancellor Merkel was leaning over Trump at a NATO summit. And what she's trying to impose on him is you have to stay. What Trump told him in Trump 1 is you have to gear up your expenditure on military. And it didn't happen. What Trump's doing now, he's forcing. And by forcing them, they do it. But it could have happened earlier. It could have happened by taking that threat serious. But Europe chose to continue to rely on the US, and the Biden administration stepped back in. Now with the war in Ukraine, and I see my friend from Ukraine here, Europe is starting to understand that we need these capabilities because the threat is clear, it's on the borders of Europe, and it's a European task to confront that threat. It's not a US task. US used to be a big brother that help and hand over us. Now we're back to having to be grown-ups and to face our own responsibility. And I think that way, I look at the US-European relationship is a much more fruitful way to look at this administration. Maybe they have a style we don't quite embrace. Maybe, I could say a few other things, but I won't. But the point they make is valid. Europe has to face its own responsibility. 80 years after the war, we can no longer rely on the US to be the sole provider of security. We got to do it ourselves. And that's a huge chance for the UK. Okay. Huge chance.
On that note, I hope you now see why I'm always enjoying my conversations with Axel. There were a lot more questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but there was a lot that we heard that was really interesting. So Axel, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
So it's always a sign of a great event when the questions could have gone on for hours. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you very much to our special guest, Professor Weber. Thank you as well. We hope that you will keep an eye out for future events on campus. We do these public lectures on a regular basis, so we welcome you back on those future occasions. In the meantime, we would like to invite you up on the first floor. You'll pass the lovely Nobel Wall. I think 101 Nobel laureates affiliated with the university and the Booth School. As you go up, a networking reception awaits. Please carry on the conversation upstairs. And thank you again for being here.